shaft.
Welcome back. In this episode we continue with the wiring of the Mini. The first job was to fit the bracket I made at the end of the last episode to the Mini's bulkhead. The addition of the captive nuts meant this job was considerably easier to do by myself while the windscreen was still in place. With the bracket fitted, I could then design the rest of the mount for the fuse panel and the relay block. What you see in front of you is the evolution and design of the bracket that's required to hold the fuse panel and relay blocks in place. It started with this fella. Now this was all very good until I realised that we mounted the fuse panel the wrong way around, and so obviously we had to move on from it. Next was this quite beefy looking fella. Now this actually did hold everything in the correct orientation and the correct location, however it was quite complicated to make and I felt I could do a better job, so I decided to move on from it. That led us onto this part. Now this is not the completed bracket, this is only the upper half. However, I'm going to go ahead now and make this in steel because this is going to hold the fuse panel and relay blocks in the correct orientation to each other and make it much easier to design the lower half of the bracket. So let's flatten this out and trace around it and make it in steel. God knows how many takes it took me to do that explanation, and that was the best one. Oh well, let's get on with it and make this bracket. What I am doing here is replicating the necessary holes and slots that were on the micro donor car to which the fuse panel and relay block clipped into. I was an idiot and forgot to press record, so unfortunately I can't show you me welding the bracket, but here are the corners all welded up. Next a hole was drilled so a captive nut could be installed. After welding in a captive nut, which I also forgot to record, I test fitted the fuse panel and relay block to the bracket and then the whole assembly into the car. I found I needed to create a little more clearance to avoid the air filter and worked out how to build the rest of the bracket. With the mounting bracket bent up, it was then just a case of welding up the corners and welding it to the rest of the relay box and fuse panel mount. Now in my experience, bad connections and wiring looms are one of the major causes for electrical gremlins in vehicles. You might have noticed that car makers tend to have loads of little metal brackets holding the wiring loom in place. They seem to work, so it seems a very good idea to copy them. some reason one of the connectors required a circular hole while the other one required a square hole, so once again out came the needle files. With the 2 brackets needed to hold all the electrical connectors in place made, it was then just a case of welding them to the rest of the fuse panel and relay box mount. And finally, before mounting the relay box and fuse panel to the bracket and the whole assembly to the car, I gave it a coat of paint. Now that the fuse panel and the relay block are mounted, you probably think that the next logical step is to start making the connections between it and the Mini's original wiring loom. Now, in order to do that, that's going to require a hole to go through the bulkhead for me to pass the wiring loom through. However, I don't really want to go drilling a hole through my perfectly good bulkhead. Fortunately for me, there's a panel back here, which is a bolt-in piece, and I've got no issue of modifying that. Unfortunately, to get that panel out, I have to disconnect a lot of the Mini's wiring loom from the front end of the car and feed it back through. And if I'm going to do that, I might as well start addressing this part of the wiring loom. This part here connects to the Mini's original starter motor and the alternator. So if I'm going to address this, I now need to look at mounting the alternator. This is the Nissan Micra donor car's alternator. It's a perfectly good alternator, so this is what we're going to use. On the Nissan Micra, the alternator sits somewhere around about here and is mounted using these 2 brackets. So you're probably thinking at this point, why not just fit the brackets, fit the alternator and be done with the job? Well, unfortunately therein lies a problem. If I use these brackets, the alternator wants to sit somewhere out here through the middle of the front slam panel. Now, this isn't as bad as it sounds because the alternator itself does physically fit in here, so we are able to mount it in a somewhat stock location. The only problem I do have though is this inner wing here. The alternator cannot fit far enough across here, so it lines up with its crank pulley. Again, this isn't as bad as it sounds because the crank pulley is actually 2 sandwiched together, so instead of lining up with the outer one where it originally was, we can line it up with the inner one and run the belt off of that. To do that, however, that's going to require an idler pulley to be mounted somewhere down here. Again, not as bad as it sounds because we're going to lose the adjustment in this bracket, which is used to tension the belt, so we can just build it to the idler pulley down there. So let's start this by creating some tabs, which this will bolt to and will be welded to this front engine mount here. Before making the lower alternator mounting tabs, the engine mount had to come out again, and yes, in case you were wondering, I had planned for the engine mount to also be part of the alternator bracket quite early on in the project. Now we've got the engine mount out of the car, we can look at attaching the necessary brackets to help support the alternator. Now this is the original alternator bracket, and this actually bolts into the same holes which the engine mount utilises, and that's one of the reasons we can't use it. The other thing is, obviously it offsets the alternator too far to left compared to what we want. What I'm going to do though is create a temporary fixture which this will bolt onto, and then we can use it to mark off the position of these mounts, and then using a bit of maths and measurements of the pulley size on this, we can work out how far across we need to offset them and mark it on this mount. Obviously it's got to be lifted further up, but that's something we'll get to when we build the fixture. The pulley on the alternator here is a 6 PK pulley, and the pulley on the engine that's going to drive this is a 4 PK. Now, there's no issue with running a 4 PK belt on a 6 PK pulley. The only thing we have to remember that if we offset this all the way the width of this pulley, the belt would run over to one side. In an ideal application, I want it somewhere in the middle. So I've got to take some very careful measurements now and work out how far to move this across that way compared to these 2 lines. With the new position of the alternator worked out, and for the life of me I cannot remember what the offset was, otherwise I would tell you, I began making the lower mounting tabs. This, as always, started off with a cardboard template before being transferred and marked out onto a piece of steel.
fairly confident of the position of this bracket. For the time being, I'm only going to tack weld it. I'll fully weld it once I've confirmed the routing of the belt and the alternator with the engine all out of the car.
With the first tab tack welded in place, I bolted the alternator to it and used it to hold the second one in place. It was then just a case of repeating the process of tack welding the tab to the engine mount. Well, it's another day. It's very early and very cold, but we can now look at fitting the engine mount and lower alternator bracket, and that will allow us to design the top one.
Well, as expected, it's all very tight, a little bit too tight in places for my liking. I think what we're going to have to do is grind back some of these bosses a little bit, just so we can push the alternator back in a little bit.
Now, I'm not going to lie, it is a little nerve-wracking grinding into your engine block. If at all possible, I would avoid doing it. Unfortunately, in this instance, I needed a clearance, so it had to be done. With the necessary clearance made, I could then start making the upper bracket. With all the parts made, I bolted them into position ready to be tack welded. Welding them together on the engine in place ensured that everything was correctly aligned. With the two main parts of the upper bracket tack welded together, I added a small gusset to prevent the bracket from flexing when the auxiliary belt is tensioned. Now that the alternator is mounted, we can finally get around to connecting the micros wiring into the Mini. This is going to require an awful lot of stripping and crimping of connectors, which I'm sure by now you're all pretty bored of. So how about you leave this with me and come back later where I'll show you all the connections I've made. Make a few connections between the mini and the micro loom, he said. Come back in a bit and I'll show you them all, he said. That sounded like a great plan until I start to actually execute it. First problem I ran into is that this bulkhead plate does not have enough flat real estate in order to create 2 holes to put the grommets in. So this had to come out in order to make a new one that was completely flat and gave me the space I needed. In the process to get this out, I had to take most of the front end wiring loom out from the Mini. This involved disconnecting both the front indicators and also taking out the wiper motor, which is since now in the process of being rebuilt. As I got that far taking the wiring loom out, it made more sense just to strip the entire thing out the front of the Mini and get it on the bench in order to make some of the modifications that are required. So that's what we're going to do. First thing though, remake this. Step 1 was to use the original bulkhead plate as a template and mark out the new one onto some steel of the same gauge. These holes are being drilled to allow M5 bolts to pass through. The captive nuts in the bulkhead were also retapped to M5. I did this because it was an absolute pain in the to remove the original 1/4 inch UNF posi drive screws that held the bulkhead plate in place. The new hex head bolts will be much easier to fit, and I can remove them using either a spanner or a socket. With the mounting holes drilled, I could move on to making the holes for the wiring loom to pass through. Of course it wasn't that simple, as I didn't have the correct size hole saw, so I had to drill them out with the closest one I had, and then file them out to up to size. With the overall shape of the plate and its existing holes replicated, I could then start to mark out where the holes for the new wiring was going to pass through. While determining the position of the new hole, I had to take into consideration the position of the hole in the bulkhead, parts on either side of the bulkhead that the wiring might clash with, and the size of the grommets, as they were obviously slightly larger than the holes that were required. The plate was made of the same gauge material as the original. This meant that the original Mini's grommet fit into place no problem. The micro's grommets, however, are designed to fit into a hole that has a small return lip. The part you see me making here is to take the place of that small return lip and allow the micro's grommets to hold in place properly. After sorting out an issue with the wire feed on my welder, it was then just a case of welding the 2 parts together. And finally, it was just a case of grinding out the holes to the correct size using the die grinder and various files. I'm going to end this episode here by leaving you with me thinning out the Mini's wiring loom and replacing the fuse panel in it. Now I've got some good news and some bad news. If you like wiring, the good news is that there is still more wiring to come. The bad news is that it's going to have to wait an episode or two because there's quite a few other jobs that have got to be completed first before I can finish doing the wiring. If you don't like wiring, the good news is that there won't be any in the next episode, but unfortunately there is still more wiring to be done, and so there will be a future episode on it. Anyway, if you've enjoyed this episode, then please hit that like button and share. If you want to keep up to date with the build, then please subscribe to my channel, and you can follow my build thread on the mini forum, the link to which is in the description below. Once again, thanks for watching.